Hey everybody, this is Andy Bachman again with episode 7 of the Prioritize or Perish Climate Resilience for Critical Infrastructure podcast. Topic du jour is climate models and how, if you're not already familiar with them, if you're not already putting them into practice as an infrastructure planner or protector, you might want to pay attention the next couple minutes. I'll try to be brief, but hope to help. Here we go. There once was a famous mystic named Yogi Berra who said this about the future, and it still rings true today. Super hard to know what's coming, but this presentation may help you have a better feel for some of the tools you could use to make better predictions, better projections. So, in the next couple of minutes, whether you're involved in electrical infrastructure, whether it's water, wastewater treatment, other water management issues, whether you're involved in data centers and communications infrastructure, make the case that you should be drawing increasingly heavily on what the global climate models, downscaled as I'll describe, can do for you in terms of looking 5, 10, 20, even further into the future. Before we go there, though, let's take a quick look at how we've done it up until now, and in many cases are still doing it. Do you get it? Do you see the metaphor? Do you see looking backwards in order to try to imagine going forwards? Not a very effective driving strategy, and I would argue, you probably can imagine, it's not a very good way to think about what we need to do to protect and or plan for new infrastructure going forward. So let's see what results this has produced so far. These days we're living with the effects of climate change. As you see and as you know, it's not being too kind to infrastructure. Using purely historical data, stuff that's happened, references back to 10, 20, 50, 100 years or so ago, is no longer all that helpful. And up until recently, it's all we've had, so it made total sense. And actually, it used to work fairly well when the weather patterns were more stable. Well, as you know, they have become increasingly less so as we've entered this period some describe as global weirding, things happening with a frequency or an intensity or in places that they never used to happen before. This is what we're up against, and what I'm trying to help arm you to be better prepared for. Let's look at a couple recent events, shall we? I'll give you just 4, although there have been hundreds. The Texas freeze of February 2021, huge blackouts, huge amount of money lost, hundreds of people killed because we hadn't hardened our infrastructure for intermittent cold events to the same extent that in Texas they hardened against heat events. Speaking of heat, the western wildfires have been plaguing California and other surrounding states now for decades, and only more recently have the fires become more and more damaging, so much so that the utilities there have to shut the power off in advance of high wind events in case that increases the chances of a fire that their own equipment sparks. They're taking action against it now, but man, there have been a lot of losses that drove that action. The heat waves that happened this summer in the UK that shuttered a couple data centers, one in California too, and the amount of lives lost and the amount of fires in Europe were just crazy off the charts. And it's not going to get better. And lastly, flooding. Gigantic flood events, not just in the eastern side of the United States, not just in Europe where they were tremendous and huge and deadly and hit infrastructure, but China big time. Heat waves in China too. So these things are happening now. Everybody keeps using the word unprecedented, and it is unprecedented, but that's normal now, so we can't pretend that these things aren't going to keep happening and aren't going to get even worse as we go into the future. We need to plan accordingly and not be surprised each time one of these things comes at us now. Here's a report from last year from a sister national lab to the one that I work at up in Washington State. They basically did a study. You can find it online if you want. I'll try to put the URL in the show notes on YouTube. But it basically says they looked at the efficacy of utility planning when they used older and older still data, and found that the further back the references went, the worse the outcomes were for the survival of those assets during extreme weather events. So they end with, or near the end, they make the statement that says utilities need to consider climate change impacts to generation and also to loads. It affects where people live and how much electricity they use, rather than basing their plans solely on the weather that has been witnessed in the past. So what can you do in order to learn more about these so-called data models, climate data models, global climate models? There we go, third time's the charm. So you can become a proficient user of the data in your planning decisions. Well, one thing you could do is get this book down in the lower left-hand corner. I did, and went through it and got some of the stuff into my head. Some stuff fell out, of course, as well. But you don't necessarily have to. I'm going to give you a couple starting points here in the next couple of slides, things that I pulled out rather quickly. So what is a global climate model? Essentially, it's a gigantic software program that attempts to capture all of the different physical forces that you see here, things in the ocean, things on land, things in the atmosphere. We're talking about people that understand physics and chemical processes, and capture those in a giant simulation that can then go backwards in time to link up with things we already saw happen, and go forwards in time when the net results of all of these interacting physical forces combine and produce likely effects in different places on the globe that can be identified. And I will show you in a second like what you can do with them. But that's the basic thing. It's running at a bunch of national labs. I'll show you that in a subsequent slide too. And now the commercial sector is getting involved big time as well. So simply stated, you take a place, in this case Denver metro area, you take a time frame, 20 years in the future from now, and you put it into the machine, you put it into the program, and all the various algorithms and equations and data that's in there mash around on some of the biggest supercomputers in the world, and out come projections, not predictions exactly, but more like general statements like you could expect in this general location around that time, temperatures to look one way, highs and lows to be one way, precipitation to be similar. And then once you have those things, you can also infer secondary and tertiary weather events, weather effects, extreme weather effects. Then, however, to be more useful for you and the folks that you work with, you might want to go through a process called downscaling. That's where you work with the folks that make and manage and improve the models, and you hone in on particular plots of land. I think I've heard down to the specificity now of a given 4 square kilometer area is what they're aiming for, and tighter margins in terms of the time frames, down to the months, down to the weeks. This may seem impossible to you, and it is a little bit far-fetched on first hearing, but once you end up speaking with these folks, you get a sense for how much confidence they have in the models. And they also allow uncertainty. No one's pretending these things are perfect, but they are, I'm arguing, the best thing that we have in terms of understanding what we need to do now and tomorrow to be ready for the future. So here's an example on this slide of a particular substation in a particular area in the general Denver metropolitan area. We're going into 10 years now, and we're curious about things like that gulch over on the right-hand side. Is that something that floods? Is that something that's possible that it's going to flood? If we're going to put new infrastructure, we're going to put a new asset somewhere around there, could we feel confident that this is a good place for more electrical infrastructure or some other type of critical infrastructure? What are the temperatures going to be like there? Are we close enough in the Denver area to forested areas? You know, if we get up in Boulder, in Colorado Springs, some of the mountainous areas, they're having some significant fire problems already. Is that going to get all the way to Denver, or is it so built up that that's not a problem? So the second bullet here is if you have existing infrastructure, you know, what are we going to need to do instead of siting? What do we need, if anything, to do to maybe increase the capacity of the cooling systems so that in projected heat waves or heat dome events, the equipment can still be counted on to run reliably? And one thing I've heard, and comes from a water utility that serves Denver that's very forward-looking on climate issues and preparing for them, is they use the projections for what-if scenarios, so that while no one knows for sure what's coming, no one knows for sure when it's going to arrive and exactly where, we're getting better and better at understanding those things. And so from a planning process, an electric utility, a water utility, a communications company, et cetera, can start to make better informed decisions in terms of how they're going to allocate their resources in the future so they can keep performing at the level they need to. I can understand some skepticism here. How can we know the models are right or mainly right? Well, let's see about that. Well, good news. While we can't travel to the future, at least not yet, we can revisit the past. And that's exactly what's happening in this NASA model, which, while run in 2004, projected out to 2020, about out to where we are, basically. We can go back and look at what that model projected. And as you can see here, and this is just one example, and there's some models that didn't get it right, but a lot of them have proven when you go back in time, in this concept called hindcasting. We look what they projected, even when the computers weren't as powerful and the algorithms weren't set quite as precisely as they have been with all the data that they've ingested in the last couple of years. We can see that the observations, the red line here, of what we saw for temperature change tracked pretty exactly the black line of what the model was predicting we were going to see. And the types of extreme weather events that we're seeing also were largely foreseen in many of the models. All that means, again, never perfect, but always getting better. And absent something better, these best tools that we have, I would argue. You'll find skeptics and critics who will find problems with them. That's good, because they help inform what the next version might do better. So these things are constantly improving. So just so you know, while it may not have touched you and your world exactly, there's a whole universe involved in the development of, the maintenance of, and the improvement of global climate models, both on the government side here, and I'm showing you a bunch of the national labs that are charged with maintaining and improving the models. In addition to the DOE labs, you can also see NASA and NCAR and NOAA. Any of these folks would be glad to talk to you. You may not want to talk directly to the climate scientists, but all of them have to have translators on board to speak to folks that speak plain English and don't have all the numbers bouncing around their head all the time. So that's one approach, especially if you're already in government. But another one is this has become a commercial market now, and I'm giving you a handful of companies that, in a sense, their business model, their value is the translation and the application of the climate data that everybody has access to, by the way. A lot of it is public, and applying that to specific cases in real estate and disaster management and other things like that. So this is the whole ecosystem that's on the job, and that you could take advantage of some of what they're doing going forward. Okay, thanks a lot. You've reached the last slide. Appreciate you hanging in there. To table thump the main points, using only historical data to project what's coming at us in the future from an infrastructure and asset planning perspective is no longer useful. You can still use the more recent stuff, but you better be layering in what you're seeing from the global climate models, downscaled to particular places you care about, to inform decision making. The models are never perfect, this is the second point, but they're always getting better. And there are people who can help you navigate through and make sense of the data and what the data is telling you, so you can do a better job in whatever mission is that you're supporting. I thank you for your time and attention. Look forward to seeing you in episode 8. Until then, be safe, stay well.